Well, it's very personal, and sometimes you may be dealing with somebody who just actually doesn't want to talk about it at all. If I think back in my own case of administering an intestate estate, my brother died some years ago, absolute nightmare to figure out the records. I discovered to my amazement that he had a Swiss bank account. Now he was only 26, so there was very little in it, unfortunately. And in contrast then, my aunt died a few years ago and I administered her estate, and it was immaculate. She actually had everything completely codified and everything, and explained everything beforehand. So, first of all, getting an understanding of what's involved. It sounds so simple, and yet so many people don't do it. Even down to not just having the assets, but also for the person to understand that, look, you may be aged, say, in the early 60s, and somebody mentioned earlier, in 20 years' time, what does that look like? And if you have modest sort of assumptions for growth, you can end up with a much, much larger estate than you think. So I think, first of all, it's about the individual understanding, and a critical piece that I find sometimes I deal with families who have already put in place a structure and passed wealth on to the next generation, or maybe to the next generation again, in which case things can be awfully more complicated. Whereas if the patriarch or the matriarch is still sitting on 100% and is able to say, now, pay attention here, this is the way we're going to do it, that's a very different sort of conversation. So it's very, very personal. It's about understanding what's there, and then, in contrast to nod, wink, wink, and you promise to be the farmer or whatever else, actually managing the expectations and understanding. The piece that I find probably the most interesting is getting down to what are the values that drive the family. And a lot of families would say, well, we know what's most important to us. But when I do a little exercise very often in families and get them to tease out, and you get different values taking priority over different ones, which of course then leads to different decisions, which then leads to rows, which leads to, and so on. So even stopping, and you talked about the treadmill, people being so busy, they're working all the time, just taking the time to stop and ask, what are we actually all about here? What does it mean? And by the way, if the family enterprise is worth X, and somebody came along and put a check on the table for 3X, would you take it? Or are you committed to the business? Yeah. So you start to test just how important is it. And those are the sorts of really, hopefully long before it gets very legal and complicated, you actually have to deal with a lot of very, very personal issues. And it's something I find you have to tease very gently. You can only go as fast as the family is able to do it. And sometimes it takes quite a bit of time.
I think, Catriona, that's a good challenge for you too as well. I mean, people are standing before us really exposed, right? Their assets, their family relationships, all of those dynamics. I mean, how do you start a conversation about taboo subjects like death
Well, we tend to find that people don't want to talk about death, but they don't want to leave a mess behind either. So they are motivated to do something about it. The giving while living is something that we've touched on in the report as well. So we're encouraging clients to have the discussion around what it is they want to do, and then also for the beneficiaries to be as educated as the client is in relation to what they're going to receive. So the holistic approach that we take is proving very valuable to the client. The family charter piece is becoming very important as well. We've had discussions with clients around what a child needs to do to actually be entitled to participate in the business. So they've got to go on and work for X number of years.
Outside the business.
Exactly. So that all leads back to the family charter. So you don't automatically have this entitlement. So that's the type of discussions that we're having with the tax piece is very important, but it's a subsidiary piece to it also. So the holistic piece, and also making sure that the individual who's doing all of the wealth transfer has actually taken care of themselves, so that they have enough income for their retirement years. We're dealing with a lot of complex issues the further up the wealth chain that we go to. So, you've got the complex structures that come into play, and there really is a need to sit down and talk about those. And I mentioned earlier on the need then for the specialist advice to come on board.
And are the clients even recognizing, when they have those complex needs?
So, they might have put in place a structure which served a particular purpose or served a particular tax outcome, but they don't necessarily fully understand it. And that's no slight on them. Tax is not their day-to-day job, but some of these structures can be very complex. And even to unwind them can be very complex. Some of those structures might have involved a suggestion around going non-resident, and that may or may not work. It might have worked at a particular point in time, but it's no longer practical or it's no longer feasible. So it's just making sure that every aspect of our clients' wealth is taken into account as well. So traditionally, we would be very investment focused, but we're now looking at all of the different pieces of the puzzle effectively, where there's structures that have been put in place from a tax perspective, there's the legal side of things where they haven't taken care of their own personal issues, and then bringing in the wider family and what it is that they're actually intending to do.
And Catriona, you haven't talked about trust as a mechanism, and it's something we address in the report, but when we got into it, we realized what a thicket it is of structures, of rules, of conditions, and so forth. But are these popular mechanisms for dealing with the kinds of issues that we're discussing today?
Well, before I came to the bar in 2000, excuse me, I worked in a trust company, and it was very common to have assets, family assets, the shares held in trusts, and where trustees would be appointed. And they are reasonably common. I mean, I considered it at that time very common, but I haven't come across it as much later. I suppose it depends on the nature of the assets, and I suppose the nature of the beneficiaries, because it may not suit all circumstances. People have particular reasons for setting up trusts. As you all know, it can depend. If they may want to, it may be a tax planning mechanism, it may be that they feel the beneficiaries are not mature enough, that they're young. And again, it comes at a point in time that perhaps if they're making their plans earlier in their life and their children are still young, and maybe at a later stage because of tax reasons, the trust may no longer be suitable. But there are issues with regard to trust, putting trusts in place, because choosing trustees, the proper trustees should be family members. There's a dynamic between beneficiaries and trustees. There's often conflict between trustees and beneficiaries. Trustees, and I know this again from having worked in a trust company, may be motivated in the administration of the trust by economic focus, whereas the beneficiaries maybe have emotional reasons for not wanting. We now have a piece of legislation, the 2010 Conveyancing Act, for the variation of trusts, which is not widely used at all. Heretofore, if you wanted to break up a trust, if the beneficiaries are of full age and full capacity, you can break up a trust. Now we have a legislation in 2010 where you can vary the terms of a trust. Now it's not it has come before the courts very little, there's only one reported case, but the legislation is there to apply to vary a trust, the terms of trust. So it's huge, but it isn't being used at all. I think people simply aren't aware of it. So sorry, in answer to your question, as I say, before I came to the bar, I administered trust. It was how I thought most assets were held. But it depends, I suppose, on the asset structure and the beneficiaries. But I don't come across the litigation with trust that often, I suppose, but I suppose, again, with what Catriona was saying earlier, Bob, there's a need to review wills, to review circumstances. It's an evolving process. As they say, succession is it's a process, not an event. It should be reviewed at all times. Wills should be reviewed, circumstances reviewed, again because of tax reasons and because of changing natures of beneficiaries. And again, back to the section 117, as circumstances change for children, wills need to be reviewed and on an ongoing basis.
And Bob, shareholders agreements is something we also haven't touched on. It sort of reverses family charter. I know in our discussions before this, the issue came up. What's the difference in the appropriate application of each in these sorts of cases?
So the shareholders agreement typically is used as the legal underpinning of the agreements already made, either informally or through the charter. And one of the difficulties that I've seen is that where some of these shareholders agreements are very complex, and the family all the family members haven't necessarily spent the time really teasing through what does it mean, then they end up with, that's not what I understood I had signed, and you get into a row. So the bit about the family charter is it's a much less formal document. It's very much about intent, about values, about how do we resolve all these issues without getting into the legalities of it. Sometimes I have to have a longer conversation with people who think that the family charter by itself is sufficient, I would not recommend that because, when push comes to shove, you actually need the certainty of the legal agreements to underpin the decisions made by the charter or in the family council subsequently.
Okay. And then, Catriona, I might just, before we open it up to questions, just bring it back to you there. But like, when you're seeing clients, are they already kind of wrapped up in these structures, or are we dealing with something much more open that we have to then maintain ourselves?
And so we've got a mix of situations. So we've got people who have some of the structures already in place. They just need to be revisited and reviewed to make sure they're still fit for purpose. Then we have the situations where none of the planning has been done. So we have clients who are interested in the asset protection piece around the trust, and we are bringing those ideas to the clients. So a mix very much of the different types of structures that are out there, and as I mentioned earlier on, the fact that some of the structures are already in place, but situations have changed.
And they might not be the right ones.
Exactly, yeah. I think by their very nature too, some of the trust structures, for example, the discretionary trust would have all the different taxes associated with it, and clients would shy away from them a little bit for that reason. Even family limited partnerships, there can be a slowness to actually adopt that, because once they realise that there's actually a bit of minding involved in the structures and an ongoing compliance requirement. While it sounds really good on the face of it, the actual, when you get down into the detail, and if they're left to their own devices and actually figuring out how to do the compliance piece, that's when they think, well, maybe I'd be better to do something else. Maybe I'd be better to just work with what the reliefs are in their plain form. They're very complicated reliefs, as we all know, around the retirement relief and the business relief for CAT. But if you get there early enough in relation to the planning, you can very often satisfy all of the conditions for the reliefs.
Okay. We have a few minutes to take questions if you have them before we break for a bit of a social hour. Just have a take and just raise your hand.
Quick question for Bob. In relation to when it comes to families, have you ever approached it from the point of view of asking the kids if they take on debt in order to keep the business?
Yeah. So the emotional attachment to what the family business is a really important issue. And the simple way of checking is to ask them if they got an enormous check on the table, would they just walk away from the business altogether? What is the extent to which, on that spectrum of entitlement and duty, are they prepared to knock themselves out and take a bit of pain or put in the extra investment, whether it's taking on debt or personal time or whatever? Those are the interesting issues, and I would always insist on having one-on-one conversations with every member of the family. So that, often you can end up spending 4 hours, and you get a whole lot of stuff coming out which hasn't come out before because, well, think of your own brothers and sisters and mother and father. Sometimes those conversations are hard to have. So it's you end up being, I came at this initially, and I started this work initially from a governance and risk perspective, and I realised that I had to open out my skill base a little bit to deal with some of the very, very personal issues that people brought up. So that's certainly what you have to go through.
Any others?
Just another question for Bob. When family members sign up to the family charter, how do they enforce it between themselves?
So that's the tricky job that I get, is to judge when are they ready to sign. And the example I gave earlier, I actually pushed back and said, I don't think the family is ready to sign this, and here are, and I set out 4 or 5 things that I felt the family needed to actually take some time. In another family that I'm dealing with at the moment, we've agreed to take a rest over summer to let some of these things settle down, and then we're going to get at it again in September. And sometimes these things are easily resolved. I often say that the family charter as a document is the simplest thing in the world. You go up and that and get any number of standard templates. That's not the issue. The real trick is to understand what's behind that and how are people actually feeling and what are they prepared to do, and where you get into situations, if there's pressure on, how will people respond? So that's where you have to actually navigate and judge whether or not the issues below the surface which aren't spoken about are getting resolved, or are they actually festering and getting worse. and then you end up, you know, the worst that you can end up with is that you sign the wretched charter and no one believes a word that's in it, and it's all a sham. So sometimes you have to actually call out some of those hard conversations, because that at the end of the day is what's going to stop the complications later on.
We've had the meetings with the family members, the people who are going to be on the receiving end of the business, and what we've found is it was all very cordial in the room, but then we hear back from the business owner that after the meeting, you know, all the issues started to come out, all the concerns that maybe the son that was working in the business had, the 3 other children who were not, and how his interest was going to be, you know, I suppose.
Or sometimes what can happen is you have the conversation with the family, and then I make the suggestion to parents to leave.
Yes,
And then the family for the first time are actually, you know, I've had one-on-ones, and now we're together, and we end up spending hours talking about it, and a whole lot of stuff comes out, and of course the parents are outside going, what's going on here? You know, when am I allowed back in? It's, you know, it's our money that we're giving to you, and all that stuff goes on too, so it's the...
It's better that because it comes out eventually, I think, so it's better it comes out then rather than in quarter, of course.
Yeah, 26 days in High Court.
Exactly,
We have time for maybe one more?
Trina, you mentioned the move from investment management firms that's more holistic service offering at the beginning rather than pure investment management we did a few years ago. Where do you see the future in terms of the services that investment managers will give to private clients and families over the next few years?
so I think we don't see the execution piece as our main business. We see the financial planning piece as central to our service. So it's the actual bringing together of all of the assets. Very often you find that if we keep it so narrowly focused on an investment portfolio, and a client then has 6 other investment properties in their own name, they're not getting a good service in relation to their investment assets. So we need to look at it holistically, and we need to measure risk as well in relation to that. So that is resonating with clients much more than just, here's an investment portfolio, you wanted, you know, you wanted equity exposure, you wanted exposure to a property fund. It's, you know, we really need to see it all together. But so in the context of the actual execution piece, we still see that as needing the people in the room, because there's so many issues involved.
And the transgenerational one is one that I find rather interesting. You know, it's one thing from G1, generation 1 to 2, but sometimes when you go and look at G1 to G3, where you're skipping generations, that can be a very interesting way of changing the tone of conversation, because now it's not about me giving money to you, it's actually I'm giving money to you for my grandchildren, your children, and there's a different dynamic to that, which is kind of interesting too.
Yeah, I think what was brought out in report 2 was the life expectancy issue. So there is a generation there that might miss an inheritance, and it's actually the grandchildren that are going to receive it. So there's the plans around that, and even the whole, as basic as the small gift exemption, you know, grandparents not using that, not being aware of it. You know, it's
early,
exactly.
40 years later,
on.
much accumulated.
Make use of what you can.
Is there anything other than investment management and financial planning? Is there any, you know, for very high net worth families that they're saying, who's providing this service, or, you know, even like, you know, wider services like concierge type services, like that kind of conversation come up? Because again, say some of the developed private client markets like in Singapore and London, where you've got firms that are migrating into doing that service, is there any chat?
Not so far. I mean, the family charter piece is something that is becoming more popular here. It's very much, you know, it's completely bedded in the UK, but around, say, I suppose the trends would be around people migrating back to Ireland. So we are seeing a lot of people actually looking at Ireland again. So the concierge piece will probably evolve into that, where there will be the full suite of services.
I mean, the commercial family office as a separate offering. So instead of having to do it yourself, that you actually engage with somebody to look after all that stuff for you. And for the families with fairly significant high net worth, there's actually a remarkable amount of stuff that you end up doing. So the dedicated family office with a couple of staff, it's amazing how busy they can be by the time they cover all the different investments and the tax planning and cohabitation agreements, and it goes on and on and on. So there's a range. Some families I find are saying, no, we're not going to have any of that, and then others, a very, very small number, will actually be highly organised and have that, and have all the international connections into international family office networks and so on.
So the non-domicile regime is proving to be very attractive to a lot of people looking at Ireland now, even the UK. People who've been in the UK regime and availing of the remittance basis over there, particularly because of the deemed domicile rules over there. So we're seeing a lot of movement. So that service and the broader issues is definitely going to become more on trend.
The funny thing that came across in the family structure was that everything was bedded down. The big row was about the use of the 2 private jets. This is an American family that was just brought into it by this marriage aspect. But the conciliary in the family office, people were telling me that is the biggest problem there, was managing the jets.
And that's the problem with families, that sometimes the smallest stuff can be the biggest problems.
I think we'll wrap it there.
For the ladies here, may I make a suggestion? In a will, always have what I call a trinkets clause. That can often be the thing that brings everything off the table. Everything's agreed, and suddenly somebody starts fighting over.
You promised me that, Ruby.
That's my rule. That's my rule.
Well, it's funny because we were at the Art Summit earlier on in the week down in Limerick, and there was a lot of clients there with art collections and nothing in the way about the art collection and no planning done around it. And the stories that were again recounted were the fact that a husband had died and nothing had been mentioned around the value of the art collection and what would happen to it. So.
And then you have a construction suit who does personal effects.
Don't give out about too much about the costs of the high court. These are minor matches,
I think we'll wrap it there. I just want to say thank you to Catriona and Step Ireland, to Simon Howley, and to the panelists, Catherine Duggan, Bob Semple, and Catriona Coady, and thank you for all your time.
Thanks to John, sorry, for facilitating the conversation. I omitted to introduce John, but John is going to stay around for some wine. I'm sure we'll be happy to talk about himself.